Welcome to episode 43 of the Yoga Meets Movement Science podcast. This is our second episode in our two-episode series in which we are talking about the excellent topic of fascia. So, I don't think you have to have listened to part one in order to listen to part two. You would agree, Travis? But it's still, I do recommend listening to part one because we talked about a lot of good information, including really like a thorough introduction to what fascia is and how we might think about it. But you don't need to have listened to that to listen to this. Our focus for today is to talk about fascia specifically in two realms. And one of them is the topic of Yin Yoga and fascia, which is particularly relevant for the yoga community. Whether Yin Yoga specifically targets fascia, because that's a very common claim that we tend to hear. And then
Mhm.
we want to turn our attention to the topic of myofascial release. And that comes in the form of like body work types and massage, but also self myofascial release that we often see in the yoga world, like rolling on balls or foam rollers. And those types of practices are also found like in the fitness world and, like post workout, like things like that.
Mhm.
So those are our two main focuses. In part one, our main focuses were to introduce fascia and then to talk about whether and how we can actually train fascia from more of like an active movement perspective. Like, are there types of movements or exercises that can specifically target fascia and get it to adapt? So that's what we talked about that time. And now we're focusing more on, I don't know, especially with regard to the myofascial release, we might think of that as more like therapeutic side of things, like healing fascia or addressing pain or things like that.
Mm.
It's a little different than can we train fascia, like kind of proactively we're trying to make it healthier or that was like the other focus of our other episode. So anyway, that's what today is about. And, just as a member of the yoga community, which you're probably in, or it's likely that you're in, you've probably just heard fascia kind of being discussed quite a bit these days. It's kind of become quite the buzz term or popular topic these days. And Travis and I just wanted to do our best to kind of have an evidence-based take on this topic. So before we dive in, just reminding you about some ways that you can support Travis and myself and the work that we do with this podcast. You can become a supporter of the show for $3 a month, and the link to do that is in the show notes. You can subscribe to our podcast and leave us a rating or a review. You can sign up for my email newsletter to stay in the loop on everything that Travis and I are up to. You could do that at jennirawlings.com/newsletter. And lastly, you could consider joining Travis's and my Strength for Yoga remote group training offering, which is a very cool one-of-a-kind program that we created. An exercise science professor, Travis, and a longtime yoga teacher, me. And it's a strength training program designed specifically for yogis. And it's pretty awesome. And you can use the code podcast30 for 30% off your first month in our remote group training program.
Where the theme for this month is fascia.
The theme in
No,
remote group
no.
training.
Yeah, no, it's
So
not.
funny.
It's not.
That would be funny if we did that.
Yeah.
A couple podcast episodes ago, we did talk about how our theme was Wild Thing. The yoga pose was the theme of the month.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But the theme for this month is not fascia.
We're not pulling out.
It's the sub theme.
Yeah.
It's the secret theme. We're not explicitly targeting fascia, but we actually are. For those of you who are in remote group training and listening,
Yeah, you should
now you
know.
know. Yeah, that's underneath of whatever the theme is for the actual theme. The sub theme is fascia.
Is always fascia. Well, and if you happen to have listened to part one of this two-part series, you might know that we talked about like how to train fascia. And we suggested that research suggests that the optimal way to actually make tendon, which is a type of connective tissue, The optimal way to make that stronger, which is like stiffer or increased modulus, are some of the ways that that happens, is to actually do moderate to heavy resistance training or strength training. That's the exercise that kind of hits all the requirements you need. It seems that research suggests up to this point, not to be too super overconfident, but that's the exercise type that seems to adapt tendons. And we can maybe extrapolate that to other forms of connective tissue. So yeah, that means you should join Strength for Yoga remote group training, or at least strength train in general. We highly recommend it. So with that is just a little recap of something we talked about last time. Another recap is just to maybe give a quick definition for what fascia is. Don't you think
Hmm.
we should cover that? We
Yeah.
talked about it at length last time, and like what connective tissue is, and how fascia, how fascia is related to connective tissue, and are they different or the same? There's a lot to talk about. But basically, a definition for fascia that we like is that fascia is a type of connective tissue that forms a continuous 3D body-wide web inside of us, surrounding and interpenetrating all of our muscles, bones, organs, nerves, and blood and lymph vessels. So, yes. Travis, didn't you think it was interesting when we were talking about fascia in the last episode and kind of just laying the groundwork for what it is? Didn't you think it was interesting how many structures it actually can conclude? It can include?
I did. And it's like it seems it sort of depends on how important you think fascia is as far as which things you consider to be fascia. If you're one of the
That's
fascia
right.
enthusiasts, then you're like, well, everything's fascia except like your bones. And
Mm-hmm.
if you're not, then maybe you have a narrower definition. But either way, most people do seem to agree with the definition that you just provided.
Yeah, that general definition seems to, yeah, not really be in conflict with many of the other definitions.
Hmm.
Which, as we talked about, are always kind of there. They seem to be continually evolving, like it hasn't been like one set um
Yeah.
full idea.
Yeah. And maybe that's because, like we talked about in the last episode, this is a relatively newer niche.
Yeah, a relatively newer, newly appreciated tissue for the roles and the functions that it actually offers in the body. Like,
Hmm.
we knew connective tissue had been known about for a long time, but only more recently had it been appreciated for more of the function and the role that it plays in the body.
Hmm.
Which is like, I guess, just to recap and review, like our connective tissue plays a supportive role, a connecting role. Obviously, it's in the name. It plays a protective role inside of us. It helps protect our inner structures. It transmits force. It transmits the force that our muscles generate when they contract. So it plays an important role in movement. Um, yeah, that's so connective tissue. It's just like more, it used to be, well, fascia used to be considered like this inner, unimportant packing tissue material. And because it had been overlooked for such a long time, that's kind of why people seem to be extra excited about fascia these days. But we know now that it's actually a much more alive, mechanosensitive tissue that actually adapts and changes. And this goes for all connective tissue and fascia, which is a subset or a type of connective tissue. So, pretty exciting times to be learning about this stuff.
Yeah. What a time to be alive and studying fascia.
Exactly. So, Travis, let's turn our attention to one of the main two topics we wanted to focus on today,
Hmm.
which is fascia and Yin Yoga.
Hmm.
Do you know why we want to talk about that today?
Well, my understanding is that this is a commonly cited benefit of yin,
That's right.
which is that yin targets your fascia.
Mhm.
And I have questions.
You
Um,
do, Travis?
I do. I have questions about that. I I guess my first question, because and only because yin was not a super familiar type of yoga to me when
Mhm.
we first met. Um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
if you could just start by sharing
Yes.
what yin yoga is and how it's different from other types of yoga.
Absolutely. And in episode 1, you and I both we talked a little bit about like our past or our background with the topic of fascia, like our personal kind of background. So
Mm-hmm.
actually, maybe I'll just share that yin yoga is actually a type of yoga that I was trained about. I want to say, I mean, how long ago is this? Like maybe late 2000, mid to late 2000s, I took a yoga teacher training with a yoga teacher named Sarah Powers, who's a big, big yin teacher. She like I would say she kind of helped popularize. She and Paul Grilly helped popularize yin yoga like back then.
You did like a full-on teacher training
I did
in
with
yin,
but not in yin.
or
So that's
not?
the funny
Okay,
thing.
not specifically in yin, but she happened to be a yin practitioner.
Yeah, I think she at that time, my best memory of it was that she had kind of just recently learned about yin back then. And was like really excited about it. So the teacher training I was taking with her was just a general, just catch all yoga teacher training, like a 200 hour. Not
Mm-hmm.
a yin specific training, but it kind of was yin specific in a sense because she did teach like flow and vinyasa flow stuff, but a big part of it was yin, and she taught us all about it.
Was that your first teacher training?
Yeah, it was my
I
first
know you
teacher.
had been doing a lot of yoga before getting your yoga teacher training, and you were
Right.
not doing yin before that. So you already had a lot of this. Wasn't your first exposure, right? I mean, as
That's
most
right.
teachers probably have done a lot of yoga before going and getting their teacher training.
Right.
But so you had some experience, many years of experience, and then you were taking this training.
That's right. Yeah. And in my previous yoga experience, which you're right, I had been doing yoga for several years before I took that training. But I had not done yin. I hadn't been exposed to yin yoga.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I definitely, and I just feel like that was maybe a little early on in just the yin on the scene in the general yoga world. Since then, it's in my impression, it's really spread and has grown more. But I feel like this is a little more in the earlier days. So yeah, I learned about it back then. And what Sarah Powers taught us was that yin yoga, and this is still my understanding of how yin yoga is still presented today, but that yin yoga was really important and great for us to do because it targeted what they would call the yin tissues of the body, which we might call like the quote passive tissues, or the tissues that don't actively contract. So in yin, they make this distinction between the yin and the yang tissues. Yang tissues being muscle, and like a yang style yoga practice being like an active practice where you're using your muscles and you're working and moving
Mm-hmm.
dynamically a lot. But yin is more we're focusing on the passive tissues, which they would call the fascia. And we know that
Mm.
that's like a category that includes a lot of different tissues, as we talked about last time. It includes a lot. But yeah, and the technique of a yin yoga, like practice style, is that you do long held passive stretches, and those stretches can last like usually up to about 10 minutes at max, but usually
Mm-hmm.
minimum 1 minute, and kind of on average in my experience I'd say 3 to 5 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the idea, at least presented to us back then, and I believe in more traditional yin still today, but I see things get blended. But back then, what we were taught was that it was really important that the yin stretches be unsupported, so you wouldn't
Mm-hmm.
use props, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, like if you think of a seated forward fold, like Paschimottanasana, so you're seated, like long sitting, Travis, and
Mm-hmm.
then you just like fold forward. If you were to sit long sitting and fold forward and maybe put like a bolster underneath your torso or your head to kind of catch you, so you were like
Mm-hmm.
leaning into a prop, or maybe a couple bolsters depending on flexibility, or a chair. Maybe you're sitting in front of a chair and you put your hands on the chair seat in your forehead and you lean. Using props like that would, back then at least what I had been taught, that's not yin. That might be considered
Mm.
restorative
Mm-hmm.
yoga, which uses props, and usually the props are supporting you in a stretch. You're like
Yeah,
leaning on the
that
props.
that was my like original question when I I think I naively thought that yin and restorative were the same because
Mhm.
of the commonality of this. They're very slow practices where you're holding postures. But as I
Yes.
now understand it, the
There's like a
the use of
distinction.
props is one distinction, and then the just the reason for the use or not use of the props, like in restorative, the props are built to support you such that you can just relax, right?
Yes,
And
yes.
yin is not that. Yin is deliberately the opposite.
That's total yes, yes. Um, and I think it's would be really common and normal to kind of get them a little confused, like you did, because I actually feel if I just kind of Google yin yoga stretches, and I like look at images and stuff there, these days I find a lot of passive stretches with props are called yin yoga.
Hmm.
So I'm not sure if it's just the modalities are being a little blended, the boundaries are looser, but at least
Are
when I learned it, it was no props.
I've asked you this before, I think. Are both would both fall under the categorization of gentle?
Yeah, I believe that they would, except that I do. It's a really good question. In yin, there is more of an emphasis on like that intense feeling, that intense sensation that you want to feel in a
Oh,
stretch. Whereas in
yeah.
restorative, and this is more, again, I think some people do blend, these lines aren't always so distinct. But in restorative, as I know it more traditionally, you don't necessarily push into a deep or intense stretch. It's usually like a mellower
Ah,
stretch. And then you
interesting.
support with props, right?
Yeah, so
Um,
even though you're not getting a lot of muscular engagement in the way that you would in a flowing or
mhm.
standing class, if it feels intense, then that if the stretch feels intense, then that by definition probably isn't gentle.
I mean, I guess it depends. It's a really good question. Like, I think on a yoga studio schedule, it would call yin yoga a gentle class, like compared to vinyasa flow. Maybe it
Yeah,
depends on what you mean by gentle, because if the stretch is
right.
intense,
Yeah.
yeah.
And
So
yeah, that's
the
interesting too. Like because you said in the yin poses, you're really trying to get into. Well, and I think maybe you were gonna allude to this. Like you're trying to get into a pretty deep stretch and hold it, right, or get deeper over the time. But
Mhm,
in
mhm.
restorative, you're not necessarily those poses are not necessarily taking you to or towards your end ranges. They're
That's
just kind of
yes, yes.
comfortable,
Yes.
supported relaxation poses.
That's right. In generally in at least a little bit of a stretch in restorative, you've got
Yeah,
some stretch. Maybe
yeah.
some people stretch a little deeper than others, but yeah, yin is more about like we're really at the like really stretching and really feeling that intensity. And actually, this might be a good time to just kind of outline something about fascia slash connective tissue and viscoelastic properties of connective
Hmm.
tissue. So, though viscoelastic properties are time dependent changes in like the behavior of the connective tissue that can happen on a temporary basis. And some two of the most common are stress relaxation and creep.
Hmm.
Those are have you heard of those before?
Hmm.
Stress relaxation and creep. Yeah. So creep has a weird sounding name. And I think
Hmm.
it can sound like that sounds scary.
Creepy crawler.
Yes, exactly. That's a monster or something. But what creep is when it comes to like biomechanics is it's when and let's say just like specifically in a yoga context, it would be if you come into a stretch, if you stretch connective tissue at a constant load. So that would be and when that happens, when you stretch connective tissue and you just hold it and the load stays constant, there's
Hmm.
like an initial high amount of deformation or strain or stretch. Like there's, you initially move through quite a bit of stretch, but then you kind of pause and you just hold there. But then slowly, the longer you hold it, the tissues creep and they just slowly lengthen the longer that you hold that constant load.
Hmm.
Then when
So
you come, yes, go ahead.
a yin class where you're holding a stretch for a long period of time would be trying to take advantage of that property.
Yes. So long held yin stretches that are not supported with props, where you're just hanging, that would be creep. That would be utilizing that viscoelastic phenomenon of creep. And like I said, it's temporary, it's reversible. So once you come out of the stretch, within it might be like slightly different depending on stretch in person, but 20 minutes to an hour, something like that, it resets the connective tissues. They just kind of became quote longer, more pliable. Like you might feel looser, but that will reset back to baseline. It's
Isn't
just
that
temporary.
the definition of elastic? Like it returns back.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
It's all coming back to me.
Yes, elastic means it returns back to like it's resting. Like you could stretch it, but it'll come back. That's like
Hmm.
elastic. And
And the
then,
visco is the time dependent part of it, right?
right.
Because like with silly putty's
Yes.
viscoelastic because if you stretch it slowly, it stretches, but if you stretch it too fast, it pulls apart.
Yeah, that's a great example. Yes. Yes. And as we defined in the last episode, connective tissue consists of a extracellular matrix and cells. And within the extracellular matrix is something called ground substance, which is like this gel like substance that can kind of change its quality. And so that's where my understanding is that the viscous nature mostly comes in, is kind of at that level. It's like, yeah, it's like kind of gel like, and it can change depending on, time, temperature, things like that. So creep. If you were to sit in that stretch I described earlier, Paschimottanasana, so long sitting, and then you fold forward and you don't have a bolster or a chair to support your head or torso, you just are kind of hanging there. That's creep because it's the constant load that's just like kind of hanging on the tissues. Then you can contrast that with stress relaxation, which is a different type of viscoelastic phenomenon. And that would be more what's happening in restorative yoga. So stress relaxation is when you stretch a connective tissue to a certain length and you just hold it at that length. Which that doesn't that make sense? That's what restorative is. It's like you stretch to a certain length, but then you're propped up. So you don't just keep hanging into, you're not pulling into deeper and deeper. Doesn't that make
Mm-hmm.
sense? So then over
Mm-hmm.
time, the internal resistance of the connective tissue changes and it just takes less um, force to hold it there. It just like,
So it's kind of like the idea of, okay, well, over time, it should feel more and more comfortable to be in this position.
yes, exactly. Because over time, things are changing on a temporary, acute basis to make it easier for you to stay there. Yeah. So stress relaxation, it's like tissue held at a constant length. And then slowly over time, it takes less force to hold it at that length. So if you were
Mm-hmm.
resting on props, it's a little different. But if you were like pulling tissue apart between your hands, you would just, if you held it there, you would slowly over time not need to pull as hard as it
Mm-hmm.
stayed at that length. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we could think of yin, traditional yin, not blended with restorative, but like traditional yin, that's like creep. And then traditional restorative is stress relaxation. But I totally admit, I think we see in the yoga world these days where those two modalities get really mixed and blended a lot. But at their essence, that's kind of the distinction there.
I I think I told this story on the podcast once before, but I once went to a yoga class and I still don't to this day know what it was. But
Oh
I think it was yin, or at the very least, like a gentle class that maybe didn't have a specific name. But I
yeah.
remember I thought that I was going into a flow class because I had only ever done flow classes before. And uh,
Right.
I, the first pose was 10 minutes or whatever,
Oh my God. And
forward
you were just
fold.
holding the, oh
Yeah. And I was like, oh, okay. So we're warming up, right? And
my.
then
Yeah.
we continued to warm up, and I was like, this is a really long warm up. And I finally figured out this isn't what I thought it was, because we ended up doing somewhere between
How
like 6
many?
and 10
Oh my
postures
gosh.
over the hour or hour 15. And
Wow, Trav, what a
yeah,
surprise to like not be
I
expecting that.
yeah, I just I had no idea that that was a thing, or that that was the thing that I was in.
Right.
And
Right.
it was I guess eventually I just accepted, but it was sort of unpleasant because I don't like, for example, the
Mhm.
that forward fold that you described. That's not, especially without props, that's not really a comfortable
Yes.
position for me to hold for a long period of time. So
Yes.
I gutted through it. So
It probably
that
wasn't your
was my
favorite.
my experience with this type of
Yeah.
class.
That's so funny. And yeah, sorry it wasn't the best experience, but at least it gave you some experience and you kind of know.
Yeah, well, I can talk about it all these years later,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I've at the very least experienced it, but I
Right.
wouldn't choose. I mean, maybe now if I knew now what I knew then, um, or the other way around. But anyway, haven't taken one since, so I guess that tells you
That might
whatever
say
you need to
something.
know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. Well, Travis, so in restorative yoga, I don't find that they tend to claim that restorative yoga targets the fascia. I don't find that to be a
Hmm.
common claim. It's definitely more within the realm of yin. Yin seems to be the type, the yoga style that claims that more. So let's talk a little bit more about yin yoga. And as we just described what that practice is like, and whether that specifically targets the fascia. You said a little bit ago that you had some questions about this. Do you have another question? Like if someone
Now
says yin yoga
now I
targets the
forget.
fascia.
Yeah. So I guess the how do they propose that
Yeah.
yin yoga targets the fascia? And then we alluded to this in the first episode last time. How could, if they're saying it targets the fascia, are they saying that it targets the fascia at the exclusion of other tissues? And then how could that be as well?
These are really
And
good questions.
maybe I don't know if you have the answers to these questions. Maybe you have the same questions.
I feel like I have a lot of questions. And I actually in my Facebook group once again, where I kind of like throw out certain ideas of topics we're going to talk about on the podcast to get like a feel for what people have learned and
What's
what
the
they think.
Facebook group called?
The Facebook group is a free private group anyone can join. It's called Yoga and Movement Science, and you are in it, Travis.
I am.
And it's
It's a
yeah,
nice place.
it is. It's just fun to talk about like a lot of this yoga and movement science stuff, like good geeky conversations. But I threw out there the other day a question about yin yoga and stretching the fascia, or a post about it, and I just wanted to ask people, what did they hear about it, and did they have answers to these questions? So I asked
Oh,
questions that were just like what you just asked, and I think I asked a couple others. Um,
did you
the
get any
first
satisfying answers?
Honestly, nobody had answers. I mean, people commented
Yeah, yeah.
a lot of them were like, "Yin isn't relaxed. Like it's supposed to be relaxing, but I don't feel relaxed when I do it." Like, and I thought
Oh,
that was
I'm
interesting
glad I'm not the
because,
only one.
yeah, a lot of people were like, "It's not actually not for me." But I did not get any actual answers to the questions, and
Hmm.
like I said, my questions were some of what you already asked, but maybe because I think it's a little more base level, can I start off with this first question, which takes a
Mm-hmm.
step back from what you asked, which is what specific fascial tissue does yin yoga supposedly target?
Yeah, good question.
Because as we talked about last episode, there are a ton of different individual tissues that are considered fascia.
Hmm.
So, like, what are we talking about when we say that yin yoga targets fascia? That there are a lot of possibilities for what exact fascial tissue that could be. Is it the intramuscular fascia, like the layers of fascia, connective tissue that run through our muscles? Is it the deep fascia that more surrounds and connects like whole muscle organs? Is it tendons? Is it ligaments? Is it joint capsules? I mean, those are just some that come to mind, but of course, we know we have fascia at a lot of different levels. Like the meninges of the spinal cord is connective tissue or fascia, and neurovascular sheaths that surround um, nerves and neurons and blood vessels. And I mean, there's just fascia like everywhere. So, what are we talking about? So, yeah, I didn't get any answers to that question when I
Hmm.
asked it, but I would propose an answer that I do seem to often see cited in the yin yoga community, which is that it's pretty much suggested that yin yoga targets the fascia of our joints, of the joints. So
Oh,
it's, yeah.
I'm
that's what they
surprised.
say. You're surprised? You thought it was
Yeah,
like the fascia in the muscles.
I did. That was going to be my, if I had to bet, I would have bet on
Hmm.
that.
I can understand why you would think that, but that's really not what the language is. It's more that like we're not stretching the muscles, like we're not targeting the muscles, we're targeting the connective tissue in the joints
That's pretty
of the
remarkable,
joints.
if that's the case.
Right,
Don't you
right.
think? We're
I
just
do think
going around
so.
the muscles, not targeting the muscles,
Yeah, it's
just
like
the joints.
because they're relaxed, then somehow we're not targeting the quote active tissue, and instead we're targeting the passive tissue, and it's generally specifically said to be the joints. The joints.
It's a really interesting thought process.
I think so, Travis. And
Like the argument is because this is a passive practice where we're relaxed. We're
mhm,
therefore avoiding targeting the active
mhm.
the tissues that could be considered active tissues,
The yang
which
tissues
we
they would
mean,
call it.
yeah, like because muscles produce force,
Yes.
they're the active tissues. But because this is a passive class, or this is a passive practice, where that means that we can just bypass the muscles because they're
That's right.
active tissues. Okay.
That's right. And instead we're
Good to
quote
know.
targeting. Yeah, we're not
Good
targeting
to
the
know.
muscles. That's active. That's
Yeah.
yang. We are targeting the connective tissue of the joints. Generally that is what's
Yeah. So
recommended or suggested.
that's a little confusing to me because when things are connected to other things, like in series, like
That's right,
one thing
Travis.
to the next, it's hard to imagine the thing in the middle not getting stretched between the other ends. But okay.
Agree.
Okay.
Agree. So yeah, Travis, that's the claim. And then I think a question that you asked a little bit ago was, I think you asked this, was how do we target like the fascia in an isolated way in yin
Mhm.
yoga? Like how does yin yoga specifically target the fascia and
Mhm.
not other tissues?
Mhm.
So I guess there's that question. That was also a question I asked in the Facebook group. That was like question 2.
Ooh,
And I didn't get an answer to that either. And
just
then
crickets.
yeah, question 3 is a really good one that you and I kind of touched on last episode, which is what does target the fascia mean?
Right.
What are you trying to target? What's your outcome measure? Like what actual change are you trying to get in the fascia?
Yeah, because it's you can't if you can't measure the thing that you're doing, then how do you know that you're doing it?
Exactly. And that was actually my I had 4 questions laid out. The 4th one was, how do we measure whether this effect is taking place? Exactly what you
Mhm.
just said. It's
Yeah,
like,
how do
what's
we
the
know?
effect and how do we know?
Mhm. How do we
There's a
know that
pretty good
this does it better than something else?
right. Like, how are we measuring that? Like, what's the effect? What is it supposed to be doing to fascia? So I find that if I look online or on social media for like what does yin yoga say about what it does to like what does it say that the target, how is it targeting it? It's usually
Mhm.
just general language that like it's good for the fascia. It's making our fascia healthy. But it's I have not seen it. I have not seen it be answered more specifically than that.
Yeah. And it might be. I don't know what healthy fascia means, but it might be good for the fascia. It might not
Right.
be good at for the fascia and for nothing else.
Right. Like not necessarily in an isolated sense.
Yeah.
So maybe can we talk about the thing where yin yoga supposedly is targeting the joints and not the muscles?
Mhm.
So as we talked about in part 1, fascial tissues. So all connective tissue is not fascia, but fascia enthusiasts kind of want to claim seems like most of connective tissue as fascia, but it's
Mhm.
generally claimed that it's like the soft, stretchy type of connective tissue or connective tissue proper, as we talked about last episode. That's generally what fascia is. And that's generally tensile type of tissue. that
Mm-hmm.
responds and adapts when it receives tensile or pulling loads, right? So like stretching type loads are the type of loads that get fascia to adapt, or connective tissue. And we talked about that in the last episode. So to me, it seems that the idea that like yin yoga, it's a passive stretch, right? So the idea is that the stretch is pulling on the fascia, and that's what's like good for the fascia. So here's the thing. As we know, and I think we talked about this in part one. When you've got like tissues in series, like you just said, muscle, and then we have tendon, and then the connective tissue in the joints, that's all kind of connected, interconnected.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when you have tissue, different kinds of tissues connected like that, when you're going to pull on all of that, the tissue that strains or stretches more is going to be the one that's less stiff.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? That's like how, like if you were to think of, say, resistance bands, which that's not a perfect metaphor for our connective tissues, but you know, they're elastic. If you were to tie
Mm-hmm.
two of them together and say one was like a stiffer resistance band and one was a less stiff, a more compliant resistance band, so they're tied in a knot, and then you pulled pulled apart, like which band would stretch more?
Yeah, it would be the thinner band, or the band that has less resistance.
That's right. The band that's like less stiff. And that's how it is with our tissues as well in the body. So when it comes to muscle and tendon, muscle tissue has a lot less stiffness than tendon does.
Mm-hmm.
So in a passive stretch situation where the muscle is not actively working, and if you go into a stretch, it's the muscle tissue that actually takes up the majority of the stretch. Tendon is really stiff, and like the muscle is so compliant that the tendon may lengthen a little bit in a stretch. Like what I had seen in research was like maybe up to 1%, but
Mm.
of its length. But we also know from research, it seems like the length you really need to pull tendons to in order for adaptation to happen, for them to become, say, stiffer, as we talked about last part one, tendons need to be pulled or strained about, it seems like 4.5 to 6.5% of their length. That seems to be what research currently suggests is the optimal amount of strain,
Hmm.
4.5 to 6.5%. So in a passive stretch, you are mostly stretching muscle, and tendon is maybe stretching 1%. And then another thing that I thought was interesting that I also read in research about this is that people who are generally more flexible, like they have in their muscle tendon units, they have less passive resistance to torque. So just less passive resistance to being put into a stretch. So people who are more flexible that way, they tend to have their muscles stretch, even like more of the muscle stretch and less of the tendon stretch, because their
Hmm.
muscles are like less stiff, the muscle part. And people who are tight, like quote tighter, that's like, what does that mean? People who are less flexible, they have like more resistance, more passive resistance to torque in their muscles. They may have a little more stretch of their tendon in a passive stretch because there's just more stiffness in the muscle. It still won't be like the 4.5%, but
Mm-hmm.
they would have a little more. And I think that's interesting because I find in yin and in a lot of yoga, it kind of pre-selects for people who are already flexible. Like
Mm-hmm.
not always, but that tends to be a big part of the population. So it's like you have a lot of already flexible people doing yin, and the more flexible you are, it seems like that's actually stretching the tendon less. So
Wow.
I don't know what to say. Oh, okay. I do know what to say. What to say next. So that's a passive stretch. But what did we talk about in part one? We talked about if you want to actually lengthen tendon, right? Like, what do you need to do?
Strength training.
Right. And do you remember why? Like, why would
Uh,
that actually lengthen the tendon?
well, does it go back to what you just described of, if
Yes,
in a passive stretch, the muscle is what's taking up a lot of the slack because it has less stiffness. But if the
exactly.
muscle is working,
Then it's
then
stiffer.
yeah.
Because it's that. So an actively contracted muscle is more stiff than it would be passively. And so in active movement, actively contracted muscles have more stiffness than the tendon. And then that's how the tendon gets stretched and moved during movement. And in strength training, that's why, like we talked about, that's why you need moderate to heavy strength training. It seems like 70% of your 1RM or above, because that's when you have the muscles working hard enough that they can actually pull the stiff tendon into that 4.5 to 6.5% length in order to incite the positive adaptations you want. Isn't that interesting?
That is interesting, and that's a bit of a nail in the coffin for
I totally think so. Not
the
for yin yoga, but for that
no,
claim,
just
right?
right.
For
No,
that
yin,
claim.
you yeah, keep doing yin, but
Yes,
if you're
100%.
doing it for that reason, well, actually, you should strength train instead.
If that's your reason, exactly,
Right.
Travis. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
you're right. I think that is a nail in the coffin. As far as for that reason, there are many other
Yeah.
reasons to practice yin.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I mean, so the language I often hear in yin yoga is that yin yoga is good for the fascia because it
Hmm.
quote stresses the joints. And I have
Huh.
asked before, like, what do you mean by that? So
Right.
stress, right, is another term for load. So I
Right.
believe the implication is that it's like loading the joints or the connective tissue of the joint, like by saying it's stressing.
Yeah.
But all I can see on like a biomechanical level of what's actually happening to connective tissue in a stretch like yin is its creep, like what we already talked about. It's
Yeah.
that time dependent viscoelastic
Yeah.
temporary change. I see
Yeah. So
creep.
there is load, right?
Yes, but
It's a light load, but that's okay.
yes, there's a low load, right? Like there is load, but it's
Yeah.
low.
Hmm.
Right. Yeah, so it's not no load. I mean, there's some load, but it's like compare a passive stretch to like strength training with 70% plus of your 1RM. There's a lot more load when you
Pretty
strength
different
train,
amount
right?
of load. Yeah.
Exactly. So I find, I mean, I guess it's not wrong to say that yin yoga stresses connective tissue, but it's just low. Like I think it would be good to qualify that by saying it's like a low.
Yeah. Well, there's like that's by definition low load prolonged stretching. Like
Yes.
that, that's an intervention that's sometimes used in physical therapy, and it could be 10 minutes, it could be an hour. Um, but like maybe after surgery where you've lost
Right.
mobility and you're
Yes.
trying to regain uh or like return to a typical range of motion, let's say in your knee or something, you would
Mhm.
do a light or low load prolonged stretch, which is kind of describes yin.
I think you're
You might use a
totally
prop
right.
in a PT context, and you wouldn't use a prop in yin probably, but
Right.
same idea. So anyway, just that descriptor. It
Mhm.
so they're saying
Of
it
like what it's
stresses the
called.
joint, yeah, and it's like, well, what do you mean? Well,
Yeah.
from a biomechanical standpoint, stress is load, and
Yes.
there's not a lot of load here. It's just
There's
your
not a
body
lot of
weight.
load. Exactly. Exactly. And another thing that we know about like getting tendons to adapt, and it's the same with muscles. If we want them to adapt, muscles get stronger, tendons get stiffer. But the loads need to be progressive, like progressively overloaded over time, because as you get stronger, you need to increase the load so that you keep strengthening. And I
Hmm.
don't see how that is written in to yin either, to like a body weight. I mean, I don't see what the progressive overload is there either.
Well, maybe only that you might be getting deeper into the range of motion, and
Mm-hmm.
maybe this is a stretch.
Travis.
But if you could get deeper into the stretch, then maybe you could be putting yourself in a you know, if you get deeper into a forward fold, your center of gravity is farther in front of your hip, putting more of a load on
Oh,
like the tissue.
like yeah, like lever length and stuff. Like you're talking
Yeah,
like that.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, okay. The way you're
But
changing the angles of your joint parts so that you might apply a little more load because you're further
yeah,
forward or something. That's an
yeah.
interesting take, Travis.
Thank
I like
you.
that.
It's a
um,
stretch.
Oh, right. No, it is. That's just right. It's a stretch. And I think also, maybe if someone had very deconditioned tissues, or like you said, maybe they're recovering from surgery, maybe a completely low load passive stretch, maybe that could cause some adaptation in the connective tissue.
Yeah. Yes.
In
Absolutely.
those cases, yes, maybe.
Mhm.
But for most, general healthy bodies with health, not injured and not completely deconditioned tissues, a passive low load stretch is just low load. And I mean, we kind of know we need load in order to get our tissues to adapt to become stronger. That's
Mhm.
kind of the variable that matters because, as we said last time, like you need the muscles to be working hard enough that they can actually pull the tendon into that amount of strain that you need for the adaptation.
Yeah.
So yin
But
yoga creeps.
they did they didn't necessarily say strengthening. They
Yeah,
just
that's
said
true,
for
Travis.
healthy fascia, right?
That's 100% true.
Which
I'm
is just a
assuming
nebulous.
it's nebula. I'm assuming that I mean, in general, when you want, like, say, a tendon, which is our base example of connective tissue, because that's what the most research is done on. When you want that to become, quote, healthier, it's that you want it to become stiffer or increase modulus, which means stiffer, or increase cross sectional area. Like, those are because they all combine to make the thing stiffer, and you could say stronger. But
Hmm.
maybe in yin yoga, maybe they're not thinking we're strengthening the connective tissue. It's never been
Who
clear to
knows?
me, like, it's not
Yeah,
I don't know. I don't know what the exact outcome is.
that's
Um,
interesting. I guess they don't know either.
I haven't gotten a good answer. Because here's the thing, I was gonna suggest, again, I think yin is great, and actually, I should have said this from the start, but Travis, we've done this together where we actually defend yin yoga against, fear-mongering claims about yin yoga, so I really should have said
Hmm.
this in the beginning, like, I think yin yoga is a great practice, I think it's safe, like, there are a lot of claims out there that when you passively stretch for a long time, that will destabilize your joints and make you more prone to injury, but I've talked about in like my courses on my website, we talked about with Greg Lehman in episode
Hmm.
5 of our podcast, like just to dispel those myths. Like that's not true. Passive stretching, it's not inherently dangerous, even though people like to say that.
Hmm.
So I believe yin, people, are unfairly criticizing it. And
Yeah.
because we're just interested in science, right? Like, what does the evidence seem to suggest? So I don't support the fear mongering claims about yin yoga.
Yeah. That's a good point. Because it might,
Yeah,
yeah, we're questioning the mechanism and some of the claims and some of the benefits, but don't take that to say like we're anti yin because we're pro yin. And
totally.
we have been for the past 37 episodes.
Wait, 37? Isn't this episode
38,
43?
43 to 5, 38.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Oh, yeah. Travis.
No, I mean
Totally.
two episodes out of the past 38 episodes.
One 100%. So with that, I feel like we could keep talking about yin yoga, but maybe we should leave it on that note. Because we have another topic to head into here.
Mhm.
But in summary, yin is a great practice. We are 100% not saying people shouldn't do it. And it's a safe practice, and a lot of people get a lot of benefit from it. But just maybe that claim about fascia, we question it. I think
Yeah,
we
but
question it.
if somebody has a good answer,
Yes.
um,
Thank you.
shoot us a message.
Yeah. We have questions. We'd love some answers. So, what's our second topic to talk about today?
We're going to talk about myofascial release.
Yes. Um, and what can myofascial release look like? We've kind of touched on it a little bit, but like what forms does that take?
Yeah. So when I first learned it in personal trainer school,
Yeah.
we actually, I guess we used all of the tools. So mostly foam rollers.
Mm-hmm.
Also, like in in our line of work, the balls were pretty hard. So like softballs,
Mm-hmm.
golf balls. It wasn't until I was exposed more to like I mentioned in the last, or Jenni and I both mentioned in the last episode that we did some work with yoga tune-up. Like I
Yeah.
took a brief workshop, you with Jill Miller. I took one with another woman. But in those workshops, the balls are squishier, the tune-up balls.
Mhm.
In yoga classes that I've taken since then, we've used tennis balls as our
Mhm.
tune-up balls, or you can also use what are they called?
The pinky
Just the
balls? Is that
yeah,
what you're thinking?
pinky
The pinky
balls.
bouncy
Yeah,
balls?
yeah,
Yeah.
like a much cheaper than buying the
They're
brand
like
name.
$2 or something
Yeah,
for a
that's
ball.
like I the Corgus balls that
Oh,
another kind of
yes.
similar application here, but they're much bigger. You inflate them with air, but you don't inflate them that much.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, but you can also buy like a $5 knockoff one at like five and below, like a dollar store kind of type
That's
place,
right.
or online. And then it's exactly the same thing. But so all of these implements would be things that you can roll on. I guess that
Mhm.
would be the best word. Lie on, um, apply pressure against yourself to, um, well, by the name of SMR, to self release your myofascia. Myo
That's
being muscle,
right.
fascia being fascia. And I kind of mentioned in the last episode, um, I don't I alluded to this that like I don't use that terminology really anymore. Neither
Yeah.
neither myofascial nor release, because I don't think you can be that specific about the tissues or about what you're doing, because we've talked about this many times. Release doesn't really mean anything, but
Yes,
we could talk
yes.
about why it's called that. Um, but I learned from a friend, Dr. Chris Lieb, he's a physical
Mhm.
therapist friend of mine. He's written for Jenni's website, guest blog post. What was the topic of that? This or something else?
It is myofascial release. I forget that
Yeah.
we will
Okay.
link it in the show
Well,
notes.
yeah,
It's a
because
great.
he has a different he calls it pressure therapy now,
That's right.
and I really like that, because I think that is it's a very literal name for what we're doing that doesn't try to over specify the tissues or that what's happening. It just is a very general catch all for everything that falls under this umbrella. Um,
Yeah, like
so,
maybe
but
that's
any,
a better term than
yeah,
myofascial release.
I think that's a good term. But maybe we should, like, why do we call it, or why do many people know this as self myofascial release?
That is a good, I mean, I think,
What is the proposed? What are we
oh, what's the
releasing, and
proposed?
why? Why is it the
Yes.
myofascia that are? And then, we're talking about
Yeah.
the fascia today.
In my experience, it's called myofascial release because, like, the implication is that, like you said, you're releasing, which again, we don't know what that means. That the term release doesn't really have like a scientific term or definition. That the implication is that you're doing something to like your myofascia that is causing some sort of instantaneous structural change. That's generally what that term is
Yeah,
implying, right?
yeah, yeah,
You
yeah.
you have, a knot or a trigger point or an
Right.
adhesion, and you're
That's
rolling that thing out,
the crux of it. Yeah.
right?
We're thinking that there are these knots that we need to release. These
Yes.
knots in our myofascial system, or trigger points or adhesions, and maybe there are even other words. Um, I
Yeah.
remember actually being taught in personal training school that if I foam rolled consistently, if I
Mhm.
did this every day for 10 minutes, maybe spent like 2 or 3 minutes on 2 or 3 spots, it wouldn't hurt as much eventually. Like
Oh,
I'd,
yeah.
I
Oh,
would,
interesting.
yeah, I would, get rid of
Habituate?
those. Well,
Oh, it's not that, no.
habituate would probably be the actual thing that was happening, but I think the
Right.
the proposed idea was, well, I could get rid of those knots.
Oh my gosh, Travis.
So
Yeah.
I believed this, and I very uh, religiously tried for a few weeks. Like before I started my workout, I spent 10 minutes on the foam roller in a couple of spots, had the timer going, and guess what? It
It did
never
hurt.
got
Oh,
less painful.
it never got less.
No, no. And
Uh,
to this day, it's still not less painful.
that's
It's always the same amount of painful, no matter how long or like how
Travis.
often I do it, how long I do it. It just I still feel
Yeah.
those tight spots.
So for you in your individual body, maybe the input of rolling didn't have that effect.
Yeah, but I mean, it feels good, right? Like I think most it hurts and then it feels good, and we could argue about why that is. Maybe you've just removed the stimulus that hurt.
Right.
You went in tight, you created something that hurt more, you removed that, and now you feel good. I
That's yeah, there's like an actual name for that.
Noxious
Yeah,
stimulus.
diffuse noxious inhibitory control, DNIC.
Yeah.
I think that's what you're
Uh,
talking about. So like
yeah,
a
yeah, yeah.
distraction to pain
Yeah, which is
can
fine.
reduce
That's
pain.
fine. If that allows you to, and the whole point, or one way of approaching this is, well, I don't. One reason for doing any sort of myofascial release, quote unquote, is to prepare yourself to then do something else. So
Mhm.
it might be used in warm up as a way to open up some ranges of motion. I kind of air quoted open up too, but it actually does increase range of
Yeah,
motion
it does increase
acutely.
range of motion acute. That's right. It does for about 20 minutes. That's what
Yeah,
research
which
shows.
would then allow you to work in that range of motion. You could
Yeah,
build strength in that range of motion.
totally.
So you can access new ranges of motion, train in those ranges of motion that you couldn't otherwise have trained in. And I think that that's okay. I don't, I don't have any
Oh yeah,
issue with that.
yes.
Yeah.
No.
But
What
then I don't know why there might be other reasons why people are using this for the health of their fascia. Like what does
Oh,
that mean?
yeah. That is for sure, there's language around that, like, we are rolling, we're releasing our myofascia to make it
Yeah.
healthier, to
Breaking up
break
these
down those
adhesions.
adhesions.
Yeah.
Mhm. But I think what we actually know from research, like, the actual demonstrated effects, like, we don't have any research that shows, that actually shows an adhesion period, like, we have never seen
We
that, but
can't yeah.
then show an adhesion, show an application of a treatment of massage or myofascial release, and then show that the adhesion is gone after. Like we don't have that.
Right.
Like
So
there's no
there's
research
I mean
on that.
that first of all, like you said, there's no such thing. There's so you can feel tight spots, right? Like in
Yeah.
yourself or in someone else. That's not it's not to deny that, but there's no like imaging that allows us to identify that um like an adhesion or a trigger point or not or
Mhm.
anything.
Mhm.
So right off the bat we can't see that with imaging, and then furthermore or like there's no way to detect that, and there's no way, and then on
There
top of that
yeah.
you can't break up something that doesn't exist or
That's
release it or
right,
whatever.
Travis. Yeah, yeah, so my understanding is, like, the clinical phenomenon of what people often call like, a trigger point is another term that we tend to hear,
Hmm.
is real. Like, we totally people do have sore spots,
Right.
and sometimes you feel that and you feel tight underneath. But then also sometimes you have tight spots if you feel that you could feel with your finger, but it's not sensitive. So you just have other
Mhm.
tight spots. You don't feel anything painful there. And sometimes you feel pain or tenderness on a spot that actually doesn't have tightness under it.
Sure.
It's like not always that it's like some tight thing, but yeah, we can't, they can't be reliably identified. And research has actually looked at that, like attempting to have, like clinicians reliably identify what they think is a trigger point, but
Yeah.
they don't all say the same thing. And
Yeah, which is like
that's an issue.
a big issue for manual therapy is like, well, you have to be a skilled clinician
Yes.
because only the people with years of experience can feel what I feel under the skin, and it's like, well,
That's actually been
that's
tested.
not true. Yeah.
That's right, Travis. Yeah, yeah. So it's like not to deny the existence of these sore spots, but we don't really know like what they are, and we also don't really know how to treat them. Um but okay, so what we do know, can I say a few things that we do know?
Hmm.
So we do know, we kind of said this already. We do know that myofascial release does increase range of motion acutely for about 20
Hmm.
minutes. And it
Hmm.
also can reduce pain.
Hmm.
Uh, it can. So like that has been shown in research. So it does do those things, but I think the question is like, well, how is it doing those things? What are the mechanisms?
Right.
And what it seems is suggested is that there are some like potentially some local tissue effects of
Hmm.
rolling, which mostly comes down to what we actually talked about earlier today, viscoelastic changes in connective
Hmm.
tissue. So like maybe the reason you get increased range of motion from rolling is maybe because you just changed, you made the tissues a little more temporarily pliable because you rolled them, which you also
Hmm.
do from stretching, right?
Hmm.
It's a temporary viscoelastic change. It resets back, but that's like rolling can do that. But that's not a permanent structural change.
No.
It's just
Yeah.
temporary.
Which is
Um,
why it kept hurting day after day after day.
yes, because it wasn't
There
making
was
any permanent change for you.
no. Right.
Yeah. So it seems that like that can play a role, and that would be something that's actually local at the site where you're actually rolling. But it seems that what plays a much greater role than anything local and tissue specific is the nervous system.
Hmm. Hmm.
You already alluded to a great one that was already on my list, which was the DNIC,
Hmm.
which we kind of already talked about. But that's basically when, if you do something that's like uncomfortable or painful, it's when like pain inhibits pain. So if you feel pain somewhere in your body and then you like roll either on that spot or somewhere else, but it's like really uncomfortable, and like just that new pain can like distract you from the other pain. And that can like decrease your pain perception
Hmm.
in general. So that's
Hmm.
a nervous system thing.
Hmm.
We also have the gate control theory of pain, which is just super just summarized terms that like non-painful stimuli can turn down the volume on like painful perceptions.
Hmm.
So if you roll and it's not painful, because a lot of times people roll and it just feels good too.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that would be like a non-painful stimuli or a non-nociceptive input. And that can, in and of itself, reduce globally, just like reduce pain perceptions.
Hmm.
And that's like the gate control theory of pain. And then there's also just like to the extent that rolling and doing myofascial release, it might relax you. So it might
Hmm.
activate the parasympathetic nervous system. And we know that when that happens on a global level, that can also decrease pain perception. And then so those are like three ways that the nervous system may be playing a role in pain in the body. When it comes to range of motion and like rolling and then you get increased range of motion, it seems like that's probably about stretch tolerance.
Right.
And that's another nervous system thing change, right?
And that, I don't know if this is true, but do you know if, like, if I rolled my, um, I don't have two legs, so this is confusing. If you rolled your right
Travis.
hamstring and then you did left active straight leg raise, like, is it somewhat of a global effect, but because it's nervous system related,
Yes,
or
Travis,
or
thank you for
maybe,
asking that.
yeah, maybe if you did a leg, or if I did a leg and then like did an arm, a back to wall shoulder flexion, like are there some effects that are
Yes.
not site specific?
100%. I actually had that on the list to talk about. There crossover and non-local effects that happen from
Yeah,
rolling, and they happen both with pain and with range of motion. So it's
cool.
exactly as you described, but maybe I could talk about someone with two legs, which is because we
Yeah,
have
that's
actual
more
research.
simple.
We have actual research that shows that if you roll like the calf muscles on say the side that's not painful, and say you had a painful calf on the other side, so rolling the non-painful side can decrease pain in the painful side. And that's
Wow.
like been shown in research. And then another cool study showed that when you roll the quadriceps, the front thigh muscles, on one side, you got it's technically increased pain pressure thresholds, but that actually just
Hmm.
means decreased pain whatever tolerance or whatever, increased pain tolerance. So you roll the quads on one side, you get increased pain pressure thresholds on the hamstrings of that same side and on the quads of the opposite side. Like that's
I've
what the
I've
study looked
actually
at.
been a subject in some of these pain pressure threshold.
What?
Yeah. So
That's
I
so
have,
cool. So you know about it.
Yeah, I have colleagues. I can explain briefly what it is. I've had it done on my traps, but basically, they have this gauge where they can measure the how much pressure they're putting into the muscle, and
Hmm.
uh, they instruct you to tell them when it starts to hurt. And I forget
Yes.
what the maybe it's like tell me when it's a 3 out of 10 or tell me when it's a 7 out of 10 or I don't know what the just instructions are,
Hmm.
but to let me know when it hurts. And they slowly push harder and harder and harder, and then you say, "Oh, it hurts." And the tester has to be really systematic about trying to
Right.
increase the like keep the rate kind of consistent so they're not just like
Yes.
ramping up really fast.
Super fast. Yeah.
So there's some skill involved.
Thank you for explaining that from your own personal experience as a research subject.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
that makes so, like, if they tested you before and then they gave you an intervention and then they tested you
Hmm.
after, and if you didn't feel the pain until it was more pressure,
Exactly.
then that would increase your pain pressure threshold, right?
Right.
That is so cool, and that's what this one study that I was talking about rolled the quads on one side, and you got increased pain pressure thresholds on those hamstrings. That's the opposite side of the leg. You didn't roll that, and then quads
Hmm.
on the opposite leg. So it's a
Awesome.
global neuromodulatory thing that's happening.
So myofascial release. Um, what about that? Is it good? Is it not good? Is it targeting the
Oh,
fascia?
yeah, 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 yeah. I think the practice of rolling can be really people love it, can be really beneficial. It can, downregulate the nervous system. It can be de-stressing. We don't seem to science doesn't seem to support that it actually releases myofascia. So there's actually a really great paper. This is a narrative review. And their paper is, do self myofascial release devices release myofascia? Rolling mechanisms, a narrative review. And they basically just kind of went over some of the stuff we already talked about.
Hmm.
But I think what they suggest, and I like, I see them as authorities. They say this review submits that there is insufficient evidence to support that the primary mechanisms underlying rolling and other similar devices are the release of myofascial restrictions, and thus the term self myofascial release devices is misleading.
Hmm.
To the uninformed, the term self myofascial release may perpetuate an incorrect or false mechanism of rolling. It's misleading and a misnomer. So they don't
There you
seem
go.
to like the term. And I think when you say, so is myofascial release good? I think the practice is good.
Yeah.
Uh, I don't think that the term that's used is accurate or describing
Yeah.
what's really happening.
Right.
And maybe gives, I think maybe a reason it could be a counterproductive term and a term I don't really like is, first of all, it's not accurate. But
Hmm.
second of all, it implies that there's an issue in your tissue and that you need,
Right.
it's like kind of structurally rooted?
Yeah. It that could have a nocibic effect if you think that like I thought that I needed to do that before I exercised because I had to get rid of these knots because they were bad.
Right. That's right. You
And
thought that.
and that
Yeah.
slow like that can be counterproductive because I can then believe that there's something wrong with my body. It can also be counterproductive because I'm spending a lot of time doing something where I could the opportunity
Hmm.
cost of doing something else.
Yeah,
So
Travis.
for a long time, I stopped doing any sort of rolling. Although I recently picked it back up again because I actually do like it.
It's
um,
good. It's a good practice. Like it can be helpful.
yeah, yeah. It feels good to me to do before a workout, and if I don't need to spend that long doing
Maybe
it,
as
but
long as you were.
yeah, if I have a few minutes, I get to the gym early, then
Mhm.
and especially like on days where I'm feeling a little bit more um just like not as limber. um
Yes.
if I feel like I need a little bit more of a warm up, then that sometimes helps me
Yeah.
get going.
I think that's excellent. And that seems like a very evidence-based use of rolling.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, when I first was exposed to it, I heard like, oh, you have to roll out your muscles like a rolling pin to
Yeah.
improve the quality
The
before you
quality.
start working them.
The quality, Travis.
That was what, yeah, I imagined my muscles were like dough that had to be rolled before, I had to prep the tissue quality
Right.
before I could work on anything
Yes.
else.
Before you like earn the right or whatever to
Yeah. Yes.
then load your body more or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that type of narrative around rolling is not so great. But if we use it for the reasons it's actually been shown to be helpful, increased range of motion, decreased pain, I think that's great. Um, but yeah, I think, yeah, just using it in ways that could potentially create nocebo where we're implying there are problems with your tissue, with your body, and we're fixing those problems by rolling.
Yeah.
I don't know that that's super productive.
Right. And then the other thing that people would say in response to our use is, well, why do you need to, like, if you are experiencing a limitation in range of motion or pain, then maybe you need to get to the root cause of that instead of temporarily band-aiding it with the foam rolling, which I don't
Right. People
subscribe
say
to
that,
that.
but
Yeah,
yeah,
like
I
it's
mean,
fine. It's just fine.
right. Right. And I don't if you open up your range of motion and then you strength train that range of motion, we know from our previous podcast episodes that strength training through full range of motion is a really good way to create flexibility and increase range of motion. So
Yeah.
I don't see what's wrong with it.
Yeah, I guess if you have to use it as a crutch, if you can't exercise without doing it, if you feel like you can't exercise without doing it, and you're spending a lot of time doing it before,
Yeah.
maybe that is a questionable practice. But if you do it occasionally because you like it and you're not, you know you only need 5 or 10 minutes on it and it feels good, then, and you understand what's happening and why,
Yeah.
then I think that's
Exactly.
all good.
I feel, Travis, like what we're kind of suggesting about myofascial release is kind of similar to the yin yoga thing, which is that both practices are super solid and like they're good reasons to do both. But maybe we
Oh,
just don't need the narratives around them that aren't really supported by what research
that's a
suggests.
really nice connection.
Thank you. Do you agree?
I do agree.
It's kind of both of them,
I,
right?
yeah, absolutely.
And I feel like, I don't know, it's just one of the many reasons that I personally love learning more about the human body and how things work and how movement happens, how pain science works, interoception, all like the more that we learn about that, the more we can kind of clarify some of the things that we say, we can clarify things we hear, and we can just maybe be more when we're more aligned with what's like actually happening, I think we can then choose what we decide to do with our body and to our body in a more effective manner that helps us reach our goals.
I agree. I think this has been enriching for that reason.
Exactly. Travis, do you think that we thoroughly covered what we intended to go over?
I think we did it.
I think we did. We did. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me.
Thank you, Jenny.